Hello, my name is Brandon Hendrickson. This is a run-through for your perusal and radically honest feedback of a talk that I'm hoping to give at Darwin Day 2017. Okay, so here it comes. When I cut this, it makes my eyes hurt. Why does this hurt? I know what you're thinking right now. You're probably thinking it hurts because this is an onion. But why do onions hurt us? I think so often we take these amazing phenomena of nature and just pass them by and assume that they are that way because they've always been that way. But when we peel back the layers of this onion, of its story, why do they hurt? It turns out that scientists have done a lot of research on this and actually have some ideas. And their ideas form something like this story. Once upon a time, a long time ago, before humans, there was an unbelievably beautiful flower. And this sort of flower excelled at taking sunlight and taking rain and taking dirt and combining them all together and making more flowers. These flowers have, actually this kind of flower has tons of little flowers on it. Each one of these tiny little flowers produces seeds, and these seeds spread all throughout. And these plants, these flowers reproduce themselves. They multiplied, and it was fantastic. And if that was the only story that we had, it would be a very happy and kind of boring story. But the story has a villain, and that villain is... not the seeds, those are the babies. And the villain of the story is the dreaded caterpillar who would come and eat our beautiful plants, our beautiful flowers alive. The plants produce tons and tons of seeds, in part to ward off the attacks of the caterpillars. But the more seeds that they produce, the more caterpillars could be born to eat all those seeds. And so they were stuck in this stalemate. They were stuck in this arms race of just going back and forth, more seeds, more caterpillars, more seeds, more caterpillars, birth, death, birth, death. It was this stalemate until one day a weird baby plant was born. Or maybe I should say a weirder baby plant. Flip. Oh, sorry. Nope, not that part. If you have a brother and sister, you know that no two brothers and sisters are ever perfectly alike. And it's the same way with plants, too. Every plant that's born is ever so slightly different than the other plants. But one day, so everyone's weird in their own way in the plant world. But one day there was a plant born that was weird in this very specific way. All plants, it turns out, suck up sulfur from the soil. Sulfur is that element that you smell when you smell rotten eggs. It smells disgusting. It kind of wounds your nose. All plants suck up the sulfur that's in the soil, and they suck it up in order to help make their cells work, in order to help the plants live. Well, this weird baby plant sucked up ever so slightly more sulfur into it. Not the weirdest thing, frankly, as plants go, but because it sucked up more sulfur into it, when the caterpillars came the next year, they decided to not eat that weird plant, because the sulfur smelled. It kind of hurt them a little bit. They decided to eat all of the other brothers and sister plants that didn't have that noxious smell to them. And so this plant survived. It had babies, and those babies that made the seeds. The babies spread all around, and now a lot of the plants that grew the next year in the valley, or wherever this was, scientists actually aren't sure, they were of this weird plant. They came from this weird plant, and they had this weird trait where they used more sulfur to ward off insect attacks. So now it was, so here's the sulfur, they sucked it up from the dirt, and now these plants have more sulfur as part of them. The plants proliferated, and they were back again in this arms race with the caterpillars, where there was birth and death, and plants and caterpillars. But now the plants had a leg up. They had the advantage. And so it continued until another day there was an even weirder plant born that happened to suck up even more sulfur than the plants did before it, than its ancestor plants had. And now this plant that sucked up even more sulfur was more noxious to the caterpillars when they came. So when the caterpillars came the next year, they said, oh gosh, we're going to leave that one alone. If we have to eat any of these plants, we're going to eat the ones that have the less sulfur, still more than they used to, but less sulfur than this terrible plant has. And so the one that had the most sulfur, it wasn't eaten, and it had tons of babies, and those babies themselves tended to have lots of sulfur in them, and they didn't die. They weren't eaten by the caterpillars, and because of that, they spread throughout the next valleys, and all around, and became this cycle of birth and death, and birth and death, and birth and death, and birth and weird baby and death, and weird baby and death, and birth and death, and birth and death, and weird babies. And every time you had a weird baby here meaning one that happened to suck even more sulfur up from the ground. Every time that happened, it had the kids, baby plants, that would survive more. And so the whole population of plants in that valley got to have more and more and more and more sulfur in it. Never like a ton more sulfur, not all at once, but over time it got ratcheted up until all of the baby plants that were being born in this area, that are this sort of plant, had so much sulfur they almost didn't know what to do with it. These plants needed to make these tiny little bags inside of their cells just to hold the sulfur and the other chemicals that they used to combine with the sulfur. And when these bags were broken, like if an animal ate it, these sulfur molecules would fly through the air. There's the wings of our Darwin day. They'd fly through the air, and they'd hit the skin, they'd hit the eyes of any kind of animal that was trying to eat it, and they would burn. Now no longer do they just stink, they actually burned. Sulfur is something that we used to use in gunpowder. It is a very volatile, very powerful element. They got to be they got to have so much sulfur in them because of this cycle of birth and death and weird babies that parts of the plants began to swell. So this is like the root part of the plant. Other relatives of onions stuck their extra sulfur in different parts of the plants. They got to be so powerful that now, if an animal tries to eat them, most animals that eat them, unless they're us, but thankfully, will die. If a cow eats an onion, its red blood cells will swell and the animal will die. Onions are so powerful that if you take an onion piece and strap it to yourself and bandage it to yourself, it will actually burn a hole into your flesh. An onion wants you to die. We think of onions as these sort of delicious things that we can cook with, and they are that, but they are also weapons. An onion is a flower that has learned to turn dirt into missiles. And this has all happened not because some brilliant scientist, some brilliant geneticist figured out, oh, this is how we're going to make this plant work. No, it happened because weird babies are born all the time, and every once in a while a weird baby is born that tends to survive better because, for example, it doesn't get eaten by caterpillars. Some of these weird babies that survive happen to burn. The ones that burned, they weren't eaten by caterpillars, and the ones that weren't eaten by caterpillars continued to multiply as plants will. This process wasn't planned, it's automatic. This process wasn't guided